The first time the plane exploded, Lieutenant Masaru Hayashi was standing so close he could taste burning metal on his tongue. It happened just after dawn. The sky was a flat, colorless gray, the runway still damp from night fog. A single-engine aircraft, patched and overused, shuddered forward down the cracked strip. Mechanics pushed from the wings to coax it into motion, boots slipping on uneven concrete. In the cockpit, the young pilot sat rigid, hands clenched so tightly on the controls that his knuckles had turned the color of paper. White headband, rising sun in the center, tied too tight around his forehead. The plane gathered speed, engine screaming in protest. The nose dipped for a heartbeat, then bounced. The left wheel struck a pothole near the edge of the runway. The aircraft lurched. The pilot overcorrected. The left wingtip scraped the ground, metal shrieking against concrete, a spray of sparks bursting outward in a brief, brutal arc. The fuel tank ignited. The explosion punched the air out of Hayashi's lungs. Heat slammed into his face and chest, hot enough to make his eyes sting instantly. For a moment, there was only white and orange and black, fire swallowing the front half of the plane. The sound came a split second later, a concussive roar that drowned out every other noise on the base, flattening thought into raw sensation. Shattered pieces of metal spun through the air. One chunk of fuselage thudded into the concrete a few paces from where he stood. Another skidded past with a high, whining scrape, trailing embers like fireflies. Fuel burned in a wide, crawling puddle beneath what remained of the wings. Against all logic, the pilot was still alive. He dragged himself out through a ragged tear in the side of the cockpit, one arm useless at his side, the other clawing for purchase on the twisted metal. His flight suit was scorched and smoking. Fabric melted into patches of raw, blistered skin. He slid down to the runway and crumpled to his knees, coughing, trying to suck air into lungs that had just inhaled flame. Steam and smoke wrapped him in a filthy halo. His hair was half burned away. Ash clung to the ruins of his eyebrows. When he tried to speak, nothing came out, only a hoarse rasp that sounded more like an animal than a man. For a heartbeat, everyone on the runway froze. Mechanics stood with hoses in limp hands. Ground crew stared, expressions blank with shock. Even the guards along the fence stopped their restless pacing and stared at the burning wreck and the boy who had somehow fallen out of death's first open hand. Then Captain Nakamura started walking. He moved at a measured pace, each step deliberate, boots clicking against the cracked concrete with parade ground precision. His uniform looked out of place here, clean and sharply pressed in a landscape of oil stains and ash. Lines of fatigue carved deep grooves around his mouth, but his back was straight, his gaze focused. He stepped through smoke and heat without flinching. A mechanic tried to swing the hose across to cut the flames between Nakamura and the wreck, then thought better of it when the captain did not slow. A medic dropped to one knee beside the pilot, hands already reaching for a bandage packet. The boy's head lolled, his eyes fluttered, then fixed on the medic's face with wild, desperate hope, as if this stranger might be a doorway out of the nightmare. Nakamura's hand snapped out and closed around the medic's wrist. The grip was not violent, but it was absolute. The medic looked up, startled. Foam and water hissed somewhere to the side as another hose finally found its target. The flames shrank slightly, but the heat was still intense enough to make the air shimmer. Nakamura looked down at the boy. The pilot's lips moved soundlessly. His eyes flicked between the wreckage and the officer looming over him. Tears carved clean tracks through the soot on his cheeks, mixing with sweat and the clear fluid bubbling up from blistered skin. "This one will fly again," Nakamura said. His voice was even and unhurried. He did not raise it. He did not need to. The words carried across the stunned silence of the runway, like a blade sliding out of its sheath. The medic blinked, confusion and disbelief colliding on his face. His gaze flicked instinctively to the boy's burned hands, the ruined skin around his mouth, the ragged edge of his scorched flight suit. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Nakamura's fingers tightened once, then released his wrist. "Have him treated," the captain said. "Enough to sit, enough to see. He will be ready for the next sortie." The burned pilot's breath hitched. His eyes widened. He understood. Even through pain and shock, he understood exactly what those words meant. His gaze found Hayashi. For a brief, searing moment, their eyes locked. The boy's terror was naked, stripped of every layer of training and slogans. There was a question buried in it, one that could not be spoken because his throat was cooked and his mouth would not form sounds. It did not need words. Is there any way out? Hayashi's training answered for him. His body straightened almost imperceptibly. His chin dipped in a small automatic nod that meant acknowledgement of an order, not mercy. It was the only answer he had. Two ground crewmen stepped forward. They hooked their hands under the pilot's armpits, careful but efficient, and heaved him up. His legs buckled, his boots scraped over concrete, leaving faint streaks of soot and blood as they dragged him toward the infirmary. Nakamura turned away before they had taken 3 steps. The fire hissed and spat behind him. The twisted remains of the plane sagged inward as the last of the fuel burned itself out. Smoke hung over the runway like a low, dirty cloud. The smell of burned flesh mixed with gasoline and hot metal and lodged itself in the back of Hayashi's throat. That was how the day began. By mid-morning, the photographs on the memorial board in the operations hut had gained another empty space. Someone would find a picture of the burned pilot, if there was one, and slide it into a frame before sunset. The board was already overcrowded. New frames hung in uneven lines along the bottom edge and up the sides, some overlapping as men tried to make room for more faces. Earlier in the war, they had left more space between each photograph. They had not expected to need quite so many. Hayashi stood in front of that board now, clipboard in hand, eyes moving over faces that had started to blur into each other, smiles, stiff formal poses, awkward attempts at seriousness, civilian clothes, uniforms. Some had been taken in studios with painted backdrops of gardens or temples. Others were plain, cropped from family snapshots where sisters or parents had been neatly cut out of the frame to keep the focus on the soldier. He remembered a few clearly, the pilot who had drawn little caricatures of everyone in the mess hall, the one who had a laugh too loud for such a small body, the quiet man who had written letters every night to a wife who was already a widow by the time he took off on his final mission. Most of the faces, though, had melted into a single composite, young, earnest, wearing expressions that balanced pride, fear, and something like disbelief that their lives had come to this. Behind him, papers shuffled. The telephone on the central table clicked as its receiver was lifted and replaced. Voices murmured over maps and numbers. The operations hut was the heart of the base, but it beat in paperwork and ink, not in gunfire. Captain Nakamura stood bent over a map pinned to the wall, tracing a line with one finger from the coast out toward the sea. Enemy ships reported here and here, he said, though not to Hayashi specifically. He was talking to the room, to the air, to the idea of control. Transports, escorts, carriers. They are tightening the ring. They believe they can strangle us. We will remind them what it costs. He turned, eyes landing on Hayashi. There will be 12 special attack sorties in the first wave tomorrow, he said. New arrivals are to be prioritized. They are fresh. Their resolve is strong. Their planes are still intact. Hayashi answered as regulations required. Understood. Nakamura's gaze flicked once to the board of photographs, then away, as if it were a detail in the scenery and nothing more. See that the list is ready by nightfall, he said. I expect names, not excuses. The stack of folders waited on Hayashi's desk like small, patient verdicts. He carried them into his narrow office and set them down, feeling the familiar lightness of paper that somehow always weighed more than it should. The room was barely big enough for the desk, a chair, and a cabinet. The only window looked out toward the sea. On clear days, he could see the horizon where water met sky in a thin, sharp line. Today, mist blurred the boundary, folding gray into gray. He sat. The chair creaked faintly. He opened the first folder. Name, age, unit, training evaluations, notes from instructors. Occasionally, a short handwritten comment at the bottom from someone who had actually spoken to the man whose life was summarized above, an odd detail that made the file feel more human. Good sense of humor, reads poetry, afraid of heights but hides it well. Excellent in formation flying. He read every line. It was a habit he had never allowed himself to break. Some officers skipped straight to the boxes they needed to check. Fit, unfit, special assignment. For them, the men behind the folders were abstractions. For Hayashi, they were already half ghosts. It seemed indecent not to at least know their names before sending them where they were going. He signed 2 names onto tomorrow's special attack list. Then a third. The pen scratched softly against the paper. Each stroke of ink brought the list closer to completion and the men on it closer to the edge of the world. He opened the fourth folder and time rewound. The photograph clipped to the front page showed a young man of maybe 17 or 18 standing stiffly in front of a plain wall. His uniform looked new, fabric uncreased in places, the belt a fraction too tight. His hair had been freshly cut, the sharp line around his ears still pale. His expression was carefully composed, but the corners of his mouth betrayed uncertainty. His name was written beneath the picture in clean, blocky characters, Kenji Sato. Hayashi's eyes moved to the line below. Father, Haruto Sato. Occupation, schoolteacher. The smell of chalk dust and old wood pushed aside gasoline and smoke. For a moment, the gray walls of the office faded, replaced by the interior of a small classroom in a town far from the sea. Sunlight fell through high windows onto worn desks. Children's voices recited lessons in unison, a soft, steady murmur that rose and fell like waves. He saw a younger version of himself, small for his age, sitting in the back row where he thought the teacher would not notice when his concentration drifted. He remembered tapping a pencil against the edge of the desk, following dust motes with his eyes as they floated in a slant of light. He remembered the day the earth moved. The first jolt had thrown half the class to the floor. The walls had trembled like paper screens in a storm. The shelving unit at the back of the room, stacked with books and supplies, had lurched forward with agonizing slowness, its center of gravity sliding past safety. He had looked up and seen its shadow falling directly over him. Fear had pinned him to the seat. His limbs would not answer the frantic orders his mind screamed. The shelf tipped, then fell. Hands grabbed his shoulders and yanked him sideways. The world became a blur of speed and dust and splintering wood. The shelf crashed into his desk, splintering it in half, the corner smashing down where his head had been an instant before. Books flew in all directions. Chalk shattered on the floor. Children screamed, high-pitched and terrified. He lay on the floor, lungs locked, ears ringing. Above him, the face of his teacher appeared, hair and eyebrows dusted white, a thin line of blood running from a cut along his hairline down toward his eye. Haruto Sato's hands had trembled slightly as he checked the boy's arms, his legs, his skull for injuries. His voice had been hoarse but steady as he told him to breathe, to get up, to move toward the doorway. When the aftershocks came, he had moved from desk to desk, guiding children out with the same calm urgency, as if pulling them all one by one out from under the falling shelf. Hayashi had never forgotten the feeling of being dragged back from the precise place where death would have fallen. He had never forgotten the look in his teacher's eyes, the mixture of fear and determination, the unspoken promise that as long as he could move, he would not let his students be crushed. Years later, wearing an officer's uniform and sitting behind a desk that decided the direction of other young men's deaths, he held the folder with the name Kenji Sato on it and felt that day collapse into this one. He flipped to the next page. The training evaluations were good. Above average in navigation, strong marks in formation and discipline. Instructors described Kenji as calm, obedient, unlikely to question orders. There was a note about his family, a widowed father, 2 younger sisters, still living in the same town where the classroom had once shaken itself, almost to pieces. At the back of the folder was an extra sheet of paper, different from the rest. The stock was slightly thicker. The ink had soaked into it more deeply. It was a letter, handwritten in a neat, slightly old-fashioned script. To the officers who will be responsible for my son's service, Hayashi read. The letter spoke of Kenji as a diligent boy, not remarkable in any way, except through his willingness to work hard. It mentioned how proud the father was that his son had been chosen for flight training, how he had watched planes trace lines across the sky when he was small and said that one day he wanted to be up there too. It did not mention the day when Haruto Sato had saved another small boy's life by moving faster than fear. Near the end, the tone shifted. I understand that my son's path may require the highest sacrifice, the letter said. As his father, I have tried to teach him to serve with honor and not to turn away from duty. Yet I ask you this as a man, and not only as an officer. Remember that he is not only a soldier, he is my son. He is the last of my line. If you can, watch over him. If you cannot, then at least remember his name when you write your reports. The signature at the bottom was precise and steady. Haruto Sato. The office felt smaller. The air seemed to thicken in his lungs. Hayashi set the letter down carefully, as if it might shatter if he let it fall too hard against the desk. A knock sounded at the door. "Lieutenant," an orderly's voice said from the hallway, "the new pilot from the mainland unit has arrived. You asked that he be sent here for processing. Send him in." The word came out faster than he intended. He cleared his throat and repeated it, more evenly. When the door opened, the boy from the photograph stepped inside. Kenji Sato looked even younger in person. The uniform that had seemed only slightly stiff in the picture now looked almost too large for his narrow shoulders. His cap was tucked under his arm. His hairline still showed the faint, pale border of a recent cut. He stood very straight, eyes forward, every inch of his posture shouting that he knew exactly how a pilot was supposed to present himself in front of an officer. He bowed deeply, then straightened and announced his name, rank, and assignment in the formal cadence drilled into him until it took over his tongue. Up close, the resemblance around the eyes was unmistakable. The way they focused, the precise way the lids narrowed when he concentrated, shadows of a man who had once stood in front of a blackboard and written characters with the same careful discipline that shaped his handwriting in the letter now lying open on the desk. For a moment, Hayashi said nothing. He gestured toward the single chair against the wall. Kenji hesitated only a fraction of a second, then sat, back still straight, hands resting lightly on his knees, cap balanced perfectly between them. The silence stretched. Kenji's gaze flicked once toward the window, then back to the desk, then up to the photographs glimpsed through the half-open office door on the far wall of the main hut. It lingered there for a heartbeat longer than was comfortable. "Sir," he said at last, his voice quieter now, the rehearsed formality giving way to something more human. "May I ask a question?" Hayashi's throat felt dry. He managed a single word. "Yes." "Are you from the Central Province, sir?" Kenji asked. "That specific region, near the foothills." Hayashi's fingers tightened around the pen he still held. "Yes. My father used to teach there," Kenji said, "at a small school near the river. He told me once before I left that one of his former pupils had become an officer in the Air Force. He said he had saved that boy during an earthquake many years ago when a shelf almost crushed him. He was proud of that. He said if I ever met that man, I should tell him he remembered him, that he was glad that boy had lived." The room shrank another inch. Kenji's eyes were fixed on his now, searching. "Sir," he asked, "was that you?" Hayashi could have lied. The lie sat there, heavy and easy on his tongue. He could have said he did not remember, that many teachers had saved many children, that the story was not unique. He could have said nothing, moved the conversation back onto rails of protocol and rank and assignment. Instead, something old and small and stubborn inside him answered before his caution could catch up. "Yes." The word was soft, almost swallowed, but it was enough. Relief broke over Kenji's face in a quick, unguarded smile that made him look younger still. "My father will be glad to know I met you, sir," he said. "He always said you were a man of honor, that you would do the right thing, no matter what the war asked of you." It made him proud to think one of his pupils had become that kind of officer. The compliment landed like a blow. Honor. The right thing. Words that had once seemed clear, now blurred by too many orders and too many names signed in neat columns that led straight into the sea. There was a brief knock at the open door, and then Captain Nakamura stepped into the office without waiting for an invitation. His gaze took in the scene in a single sweep. The open folder on the desk, the boy in the chair, the officer behind the table. His expression did not change. "Good," he said. "You have met one of our new arrivals. Sato, is it? You will fly in the first wave tomorrow." Kenji's spine, already straight, somehow found another notch of rigidity. "Yes, sir." Nakamura handed Hayashi a typed operation sheet, then tapped the bottom edge where 12 blank lines waited. 12 sorties, he said. 12 planes, 12 pilots. New arrivals prioritized. Their spirit is strongest. Their training is fresh. You will complete this list today. His eyes met Hayashi's for a fraction of a second. There was no threat in them. There did not need to be. The weight of expectation was enough. He left as abruptly as he had come. The sound of his boots faded down the corridor. Kenji rose from the chair. "Thank you for seeing me, sir," he said. "It is an honor to serve here. My father always said, if I had to die in this war, dying under the command of a man he trusted would be enough." He He bowed again, deeply, then turned and walked out, his steps light but steady. The door clicked shut behind him. Hayashi sat very still. On the desk before him lay 3 items: the typed operation sheet with 12 empty lines, the open folder with Kenji's photograph clipped to the front, the letter from Haruto Sato folded neatly, the dried ink of his careful handwriting dark on the page. Outside, somewhere on the runway, men were scraping burned metal off the concrete. Hammers clanged. A distant engine coughed and caught, then settled into a low, steady rumble. The base continued to move through its routines, the machinery of war grinding forward, indifferent to the moment in this small room. Hayashi unfolded the letter again. He read the last line slowly, each word a weight. He is my son. He is the last of my line. If you can, watch over him. If you cannot, then at least remember his name when you write your reports. The operations sheet stared back at him, blank except for the headings and the first few lines he had already filled with other men's names. He picked up his pen. Ink pooled at the tip, a tiny glistening bead that held everything that would follow. He wrote one more name on the list: Kenji Sato. 12 letters. 3 seconds. The night before the mission, Hayashi could not sleep. He lay in his narrow bunk, listening to the breathing of other officers in the darkened room, the rustle of cloth as someone turned, the muffled creak of old wood settling under the weight of too many years. Outside, the wind pushed against the walls with steady, insistent pressure. The base never truly went silent, but in the hours after midnight, it came close. He had signed the list. 12 names. The ink had dried hours ago. The paper had been delivered to Captain Nakamura, reviewed, stamped, filed. There was nothing left to change, no line left to cross back over. Yet the names remained, not on paper now, but written somewhere inside his chest, where they burned with a low, insistent heat. He rose without waking the others. The floor was cold under his bare feet. He dressed in the dark, pulling his uniform on piece by piece with slow, deliberate motions, as if by moving carefully he could keep the night from shattering. The corridors were empty. A single bulb burned at the far end of the hall, casting thin shadows across the floor. His boots made soft sounds on the worn boards, each step a muted echo. He moved without thinking toward the barracks where the special attack pilots slept. The door was unlocked. He pushed it open slowly, half expecting to find the room dark and still, bodies laid out in silent rows like the photographs on the memorial board waiting for morning light. Instead, the room was lit, not brightly, just enough. Small lamps had been placed on the tables between the bunks, their flames flickering behind dirty glass chimneys. Some of the pilots were asleep, curled on their sides with blankets pulled tight, faces turned toward the walls. Others sat upright on their beds, awake but motionless, staring at nothing. And some were writing. Hayashi stood in the doorway, half hidden in shadow. No one looked up. They were too focused on the paper in front of them, the careful strokes of pens and brushes forming characters that would outlast the hands that made them. These were the last letters, the ones that would be mailed only after the planes did not return. The ones that would reach mothers and fathers and wives and younger siblings, carrying words that had been written in the past tense by men who were already thinking of themselves as ghosts. Near the center of the room, at a small wooden table scarred with knife marks and old ink stains, sat Kenji Sato. His head was bent low over the paper. His hand moved slowly, each stroke deliberate, each line placed with the care his father had once used when teaching him to write. The lamp beside him guttered slightly, the flame dipping and then rising again, throwing his shadow across the wall in uneven flickers. Hayashi stepped closer, his boots silent on the floorboards now. He moved like a man crossing a frozen lake, testing each step, afraid that any sudden weight would crack something open. Kenji did not hear him. His concentration was absolute. Hayashi stopped just behind him, close enough to see the page, close enough to read the careful characters forming under the boy's hand. The letter was addressed to his father. "Father, by the time you read this, I will have completed my mission." The words were formal, precise. There was no wasted ink, no scratched-out mistakes. Kenji had planned what he wanted to say, perhaps for days, perhaps since the moment he left home. "I want you to know that Lieutenant Hayashi was here, the man you saved during the earthquake. He is exactly as you described him, a man of honor who carries his duty without complaint. I am grateful to have served under someone you trusted." Hayashi's breath caught. "I hope you will be proud. I hope you will forgive me for leaving you alone. I thought about the day you pulled that boy from under the shelf. You always said one life saved can change the world. I believe that. Because you saved him, he became an officer who watches over men like me." Kenji paused, pen hovering over the page. For a moment it seemed he might add something more, some final thought that would complete the idea. Then he lowered the pen and signed his name at the bottom with slow, careful strokes. "Your son, Kenji." He set the pen down. His shoulders sagged slightly, as if the act of finishing the letter had drained something essential from him. He folded the paper in half, then in half again, creasing each edge with precision. He slid it into an envelope, sealed it, and wrote his father's name on the front. Only then did he look up. He turned his head slightly and found Hayashi standing in the shadows behind him. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then Kenji stood, too quickly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. 2 or 3 of the other pilots glanced over, then looked away, sensing that this was not a moment for witnesses. "Sir," Kenji said quietly. His voice carried surprise but not fear. "I did not hear you come in." Hayashi could not find words. His throat was dry. His hands felt too heavy at his sides. Kenji held the sealed envelope, turning it slightly in his fingers. "I was writing to my father," he said. "They told us to prepare letters. In case." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Hayashi's eyes moved to the envelope, to the careful handwriting on the front, to the name that matched the one on the letter folded in his own desk. "If I do not return," Kenji said, and his voice was steadier now, more matter of fact, "could you make sure this reaches him? I know it will be sent officially, but I wanted to ask you personally, since you knew him." He held the envelope out. Hayashi stared at it. The paper was cheap, the kind issued in bulk by the military. The ink was standard black. There was nothing special about it. Yet in that moment, it felt heavier than steel. He reached out and took it. His fingers closed around the envelope, gripping it tightly enough that the paper bent slightly at the edges. "Of course," he said. His voice sounded distant, as if someone else were speaking through his mouth. Kenji nodded, relief flickering across his face. Then he hesitated. "Sir," he said, "may I ask you something?" Hayashi forced himself to meet the boy's eyes. "Yes." Kenji glanced toward the other pilots, then back. "Tomorrow," he said quietly. "The mission. Will it matter? I mean, will it actually change anything? Or are we just—" He trailed off, but the question hung in the air between them, raw and unfinished. Hayashi knew what he was asking. Are we dying for a reason, or are we dying because no one knows what else to do with us? The silence stretched. On the table, the lamp flame wavered. Hayashi could have told the truth. He could have said that reports from the front were growing worse, that the enemy's advance had not slowed despite losses, that the war had stopped being about victory and had become about endurance, about making each day cost enough that perhaps the enemy would grow tired first. He could have said that special attack missions inflicted damage, yes, but not enough to turn the tide, only enough to buy hours or days or weeks before the inevitable. He could have said all of that. Instead, he lied. "It matters," he said. "The carriers you will strike tomorrow are part of their main fleet. If you damage them, it gives us time. It saves lives. Our troops on the islands, our ships still at sea. Every carrier you take down is one less platform for their bombers." The words came out smooth and steady, shaped by years of repeating official justifications until they sounded true. Kenji's expression shifted. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly. His jaw unclenched. "Thank you, sir," he said quietly. "That is all I needed to know." He bowed, a small, formal gesture that carried more weight than words. Then he turned and walked back toward his bunk. The envelope Hayashi had promised to send already handed over, the question already answered. Hayashi stood alone in the center of the room, holding the sealed letter in both hands. Around him, other pilots continued their own silent rituals, writing, folding, sealing. One boy near the back sat with a photograph clutched between his palms, staring at it as if he could memorize every detail before the light burned out. Hayashi turned and walked out of the barracks. The night air hit him like cold water. He stood outside the door, breathing hard, the envelope still gripped in his hands. He had lied. The boy was going to die believing it mattered, believing the officer his father trusted had told him the truth. Hayashi closed his eyes and felt the weight of every name on the list pressing down on his chest like stones. Dawn came gray and cold. The pilots assembled in the yard as they always did. White headbands tied tight, uniforms neat despite the dirt and wear. Roll call, the chant. The movements were automatic now, muscle memory carrying them through routines that no longer required thought. Kenji stood in the second row. His face was calm, expression set in that same serious, composed mask Hayashi had seen yesterday. If he had slept at all, it did not show. If fear still sat in his stomach like a stone, he did not let it reach his face. The briefing was short. Captain Nakamura repeated the mission parameters. Low altitude, radio silence until contact, no deviation from the flight path, no turning back. The pilots listened without fidgeting. A few nodded slightly as certain points were emphasized. Others stared straight ahead, eyes fixed on something beyond the walls of the briefing hut. When it was over, they moved as a group toward the flight line. The planes waited in their neat row, engines cold, propellers still. Mechanics moved among them with practiced efficiency, checking straps, tapping gauges, murmuring to one another in low voices that did not carry. Kenji walked toward the fourth plane in the line. A ground crewman helped him into his flight suit, pulling straps tight across his chest, checking the buckles twice. The leather helmet went on last, the chin strap fastened snugly, goggles pushed up onto his forehead. A photographer appeared, moving down the line with his camera. He paused in front of each pilot long enough to raise the viewfinder, adjust focus, and snap a single frame. When he reached Kenji, the boy straightened his shoulders and attempted a smile. It was small and strained, but it was there. The camera clicked. Hayashi stood near the edge of the runway, far enough back that he was not in the way, but close enough to see every detail. The order came to start engines. One by one, the mechanics swung propellers. One by one, the engines coughed, sputtered, then roared to life. The combined noise was overwhelming, a wall of sound that pressed against eardrums and vibrated in chest cavities. Kenji climbed into his cockpit. The ground crew strapped him in, checked his harness, gave him a thumbs up. He returned the gesture, then faced forward, both hands settling onto the controls. From the tower, the green flag rose. The first plane began to roll, then the second, then the third. When Kenji's turn came, the aircraft lurched forward, wheels bouncing over uneven concrete. For a moment, it seemed to hesitate, as if the plane itself knew what was being asked of it. Then it smoothed out, gathered speed, and lifted. The wheels left the ground. The gap widened. The plane climbed, nose tilting upward, gaining altitude as it moved toward the sea. One by one, the others followed. They formed up over the water, circling once to align their positions. Then they flattened into a line and turned toward the horizon, engines roaring, wings level, 12 dark shapes growing smaller and smaller until distance swallowed them whole. The runway fell silent. Hayashi did not move. He stood at the edge of the strip, hands at his sides, watching the empty sky where the planes had vanished. In his pocket, the sealed envelope pressed against his ribs. Inside the operations hut, the radio crackled to life. Hayashi stood near the back of the room, one shoulder against the wall. Other officers clustered around the table where the radio sat, its speaker hissing with static and distance. At first, the transmissions were calm and professional. Formation holding. Altitude 200 meters. Weather clear. Visibility good. Enemy fleet sighted. Distance 8 kilometers. The voices were young but steady, trained to report without emotion. They could have been describing training exercises, not the final minutes of their lives. Then the tone changed. Contact. Enemy fighters. 3 o'clock. The static thickened. In the background, the faint roar of engines and the sudden rattle of machine gun fire bled through. I'm hit. Engine failing. Breaking formation. Can't hold altitude. A burst of noise, sharp and violent, then silence where that voice had been. The officers in the room exchanged glances, but said nothing. Captain Nakamura stood with his arms crossed, face unreadable. Another voice came through, higher pitched, the careful professionalism cracking. They're all around us. I can't. The transmission cut off mid-sentence. Hayashi's hands curled into fists. More voices, overlapping, desperate, for the Emperor. Closing on target. I see the carrier. I'm going in. An explosion, distant but unmistakable, transmitted through an open mic before the connection died. Then, faintly, cutting through layers of static, a voice Hayashi recognized. This is Sato. I see the carrier. I'm going in. The words were calm, Too calm. The kind of calm that came when fear had been pushed so far down it no longer had room to surface. A pause, breathing, ragged, fast, then softer, barely audible. Father. I tried to be. The signal cut out. Static roared where his voice had been. Hayashi felt something crack inside his chest. No one in the room spoke. The radio continued to hiss, empty now, all the voices gone. After a long silence, the telephone rang. An officer picked it up, listened, then set it down. He turned to Nakamura. 2 ships confirmed hit. 1 transport is listing heavily. 1 escort reports damage to forward guns. All special attack aircraft lost. None returned. Nakamura nodded once. Record it. An officer moved to the desk and picked up the mission log. He opened it to the page with 12 names written in neat columns. He took the red stamp from its ink pad and pressed it carefully beside each name. Completed, 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 12 times. When the stamp reached Kenji Sato's name, Hayashi looked away. He walked out of the operations hut and across the empty yard toward his office. Inside, he closed the door and sat at his desk. The envelope Kenji had given him the night before lay in his jacket pocket. He pulled it out, set it on the desk, and stared at it. The seal was still intact. The ink on the front had not smudged. His father's name was written in Kenji's careful, deliberate hand. Hayashi broke the seal. It was a violation of protocol. The letter was meant to be sent unopened, but protocol no longer felt like something that mattered. He unfolded the paper and read, "Father, by the time you read this, I will have completed my mission. I do not know if this will reach you, but Lieutenant Hayashi promised to send it if I do not return. I want you to know that I was not afraid at the end. I was thinking of you and Mother and the day you saved that boy in the earthquake. You always said that 1 life saved can change the world. I believe that. Because you saved him, he became an officer who watches over men like me. I am grateful that my final commander was someone you trusted. I hope I have made you proud. Your son Kenji." The paper trembled in Hayashi's hands. He set it down carefully on the desk, smoothing out the creases where his grip had wrinkled it. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the window in its frame. Hayashi stood and walked to the small cabinet against the wall. He pulled out the bottle of cheap sake he kept there for nights when sleep would not come, poured a small amount into a cup, and drank it in 1 swallow. It burned going down, but the burn was distant and meaningless. He poured another. Then he picked up the letter again and read it a second time. Lieutenant Hayashi promised. I was not afraid at the end. Someone you trusted. The words layered over each other, each one another weight pressing down on the place where his ribs met. He had promised. He had lied. He had sent the boy to die believing it mattered, and Kenji had thanked him for it. The sun began to set, the light turning the gray sky a dull faded orange. Hayashi left his office and walked toward the cliffs at the edge of the base. The path was narrow, overgrown with scrub grass that bent under the constant wind. At the edge, the ground dropped away sharply, falling in a tumble of rock and dirt down to the water below. The sea was restless, waves crashing against the base of the cliffs in steady, indifferent rhythm. He stood at the edge and looked out toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, wreckage floated, twisted metal, shattered glass. Bodies, or pieces of them, drifting in the current. The enemy fleet had continued on, damaged but not stopped, moving toward objectives that Hayashi did not fully understand and knew did not depend on 12 young men flying planes into hulls. In his hand, he still held Kenji's letter. The wind pulled at it, tugging the paper, trying to lift it from his grip. He held it tighter. Then, slowly, he loosened his fingers. The wind caught the letter and tore it from his hand. It tumbled once, twice, lifted higher, then arced down toward the water. It fell slowly, a fragile white shape against the darkening sea, until it touched the surface and was swallowed. Hayashi stood at the edge of the cliff, hands empty now, staring at the place where it had disappeared. Kenji Sato believed I was a man of honor, he thought. He believed his death would matter. He believed because I lied to him. His last words were for his father, thanking me for watching over him. He closed his eyes. I did not watch over him. I sent him to die, and when he thanked me in his final letter, I could not even give him the truth. The wind pushed against his back, cold and relentless. Far below, the sea continued its work, chewing at the base of the cliffs, patient and indifferent. Hayashi turned away and walked back toward the base, where 12 new photographs waited to be hung on the memorial board, and where tomorrow there would be new orders, new names, new lists to sign. 3 weeks passed like scar tissue forming over a wound that refused to heal. The base continued its grinding work. Planes went out. Planes did not return. The memorial board grew more crowded. Photographs stacked in rows so dense that some overlapped at the edges. Faces pressed together, as if even in death there was not enough room. New pilots arrived on trains and trucks, replacements for replacements. Young men whose names Hayashi wrote down before their faces had time to settle into memory. The war was not ending. It was simply becoming more efficient at consuming lives. On a gray morning, 3 weeks after Kenji Sato's plane disappeared into the sea, Hayashi was summoned to Captain Nakamura's office. The captain sat behind a desk piled with papers, maps, and typed orders stamped in red ink. His uniform was still immaculate despite everything, but the skin under his eyes had darkened, the lines on his face carved deeper by weeks of bad news and rationed sleep. He did not look up when Hayashi entered. "Sit," he said. Hayashi obeyed. Nakamura shuffled through a stack of files, then pulled one free and slid it across the desk. The folder was thicker than usual, the edges worn from handling. "New operational directive," Nakamura said. His voice carried the flat exhaustion of a man who had stopped believing in anything except forward motion. "Enemy activity has increased. Intelligence reports larger convoys moving closer. Command has authorized expanded special attack sorties." He tapped the folder once with 2 fingers. 18 planes, 18 pilots. Tomorrow at dawn. Hayashi felt something cold settle in his chest. 18. The largest single wave the base had launched since he arrived. Nakamura leaned back in his chair, studying him. "I know what you are thinking," he said. 18 is excessive. 18 is wasteful. But those are not our words to say anymore, Lieutenant. The Empire does not ask us to calculate value. It asks us to deliver results. He gestured toward the stack of dossiers waiting on the side table. "You will process the new arrivals and compile the list as usual. Priority goes to those with the strongest training scores and the least emotional entanglements. Unmarried, no children, no dependents who might become complications later." Hayashi's hands rested on his knees, fingers pressing hard enough that his knuckles whitened. "Understood," he said. Nakamura reached for another folder, older and stained with coffee rings along one edge. He opened it, glanced at the contents, then looked up. "There is one more addition," he said. His tone did not change, but something in his gaze sharpened. "You remember the pilot from the explosion 3 weeks ago, the one who survived the crash on the runway?" Hayashi's breath stopped. "He has been cleared by medical staff," Nakamura continued. "Burns have healed sufficiently. Motor function restored. Vision adequate. He is fit to fly." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. "You will add his name to tomorrow's list." For a moment, the room contracted, walls pressing inward, until there was no air left between them. "Sir," Hayashi said carefully, "his medical evaluation is complete." Nakamura interrupted. "He is cleared. That is all that matters." Hayashi forced his voice to remain steady. "With respect, sir, his psychological state is irrelevant," Nakamura said. His tone did not rise, but it hardened into something that allowed no gaps. "Fear is not a medical condition, Lieutenant. It is a test. He failed once. He will not fail again." He closed the folder with a soft thud. "His name will be on the list. First wave. That is an order." Hayashi sat very still. The cold in his chest spread outward, filling his lungs, his throat, his hands. "Yes, sir." Nakamura dismissed him with a curt nod. Hayashi left the office, the folder of new arrivals tucked under his arm, and walked toward the small building that served as the medical wing. The infirmary smelled of iodine and disinfectant layered over older, darker smells that no amount of scrubbing could remove. Narrow beds lined the walls, most empty now. Those who were badly injured enough to stay long usually did not stay at all. Near the back, in a corner where the light from the single window barely reached, sat the burned pilot. His name was Akira Tanaka. Hayashi had looked it up after the explosion, filed it away in memory, alongside the image of the boy crawling from the wreckage, skin blistered and smoking. Now, 3 weeks later, Tanaka sat on the edge of a bed, staring at his hands. The burns had healed, after a fashion. The skin on his arms and neck was mottled pink and white, stretched tight in places where scar tissue had formed. His hair had grown back unevenly, patches of stubble interrupted by bald spots where the scalp had been too damaged. His left hand trembled slightly even when he tried to hold it still. He looked up when Hayashi entered. Recognition flickered in his eyes, followed immediately by something else. Not fear, not anger, something colder and more resigned. "Lieutenant," he said quietly. Hayashi stopped a few paces away. "How are you feeling?" he asked. The question sounded absurd even as it left his mouth. Tanaka's lips twitched in something that was not quite a smile. "They say I am fit to fly again," he said. "So I suppose I must be feeling well enough." He lifted his trembling hand, turned it over, studied the scars as if they belonged to someone else. "When I burned," he said, "I thought that was my punishment. For hesitating, for pulling up at the last second instead of going straight in. I thought the fire was what I deserved." He lowered his hand. "Then they told me I would fly again, and I realized the fire was not my punishment. It was theirs." Hayashi said nothing. Tanaka looked up at him, eyes flat and too old for a face that could not have seen more than 20 years. "You are here to tell me I am on the list," he said, "aren't you?" It was not a question. Hayashi's throat was dry. "Yes." Tanaka nodded slowly as if he had been expecting it. "Will it be tomorrow?" "Yes." Another nod. Then he leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, and spoke in a voice so low Hayashi had to strain to hear. "Do not tell my mother I was brave," he said. "When you write the letter, do not tell her I died with honor. Do not tell her I smiled before I took off." He paused. "Tell her I screamed. Tell her I begged. Tell her the truth." His eyes met Hayashi's, and there was no mercy in them, only a kind of bitter clarity. "If you send me again, at least give her that." Hayashi felt the weight of the folder under his arm, the stack of names waiting to be written, the list that would grow to 18 by the end of the day. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, an apology, an excuse, a lie, but nothing came. Tanaka turned his face back toward the window, dismissing him without words. Hayashi left the infirmary and walked back to his office, the cold in his chest spreading until it felt like drowning from the inside. The stack of new arrival dossiers sat on his desk, neat and waiting. He opened the first folder. A boy of 17, fresh from training, scored high in navigation, unmarried, father deceased, mother and 2 younger sisters still living in a village near the mountains. A note from his instructor praised his calm demeanor and willingness to follow orders without question. Hayashi wrote his name on the list, then the second, then the third. Each stroke of the pen was automatic now, stripped of thought, a mechanical process that did not require a mind or a soul, only a hand that could hold ink and move it across paper. By the time he reached the 10th name, his fingers had gone numb. He paused. On the edge of the desk, half buried under other papers, lay Tanaka's medical clearance form, stamped, approved, fit for duty. Hayashi stared at it. The boy had already burned once. He had already crawled out of the wreckage screaming. He had already lived through the thing that should have killed him, only to be told it was not enough, that he had to do it again, properly this time, without hesitation. Hayashi could write his name on the list, or he could lose the form, bury it under other paperwork, claim it had not arrived in time, delay the assignment long enough that someone else would have to make the decision. It would be noticed. Eventually, Nakamura was not careless. Questions would be asked, but for a moment, just a moment, Hayashi allowed himself to imagine it. One name removed, one life Yan Ed, even if only for days or weeks. He reached for the medical clearance form. His hand hovered over it. Then he pulled it back. Because if he saved Tanaka, someone else would have to take his place. The quota was 18, not 17. 18 planes, 18 pilots, 18 explosions that command expected to see reported by the end of the day. If Tanaka did not fly, one of the new arrivals would. Perhaps the 17-year-old boy with 2 younger sisters who looked up to him. Perhaps the quiet one who had written poetry in the margins of his training manual. Perhaps the one whose photograph showed him smiling in front of a shrine, arm around his mother's shoulders. Hayashi closed his eyes. The arithmetic was simple and brutal. He could not save anyone. He could only choose who would burn first. He opened his eyes and picked up the pen. He wrote Akira Tanaka's name on the list. Then he opened the folder of the 17-year-old boy, the one with the 2 younger sisters. He read the instructor's notes again. Calm demeanor. Follows orders without question. At the bottom of the evaluation, in smaller handwriting, someone had added a comment. Candidate shows signs of acute anxiety under stress. Recommend psychological evaluation before combat assignment. Hayashi stared at the line. It was small, easy to miss, but it was there, written in ink that had not yet faded. He reached for a different pen, one with slightly thicker ink, and carefully drew a bracket around the comment. Then, in the margin, he wrote in his neatest hand, "Evaluation completed. Candidate deemed psychologically unfit for special operations. Reassigned to ground crew pending further review." He signed it, dated it, stamped it with the operation seal. Then he moved the boy's folder to the bottom of the stack and opened the next one. A pilot of 19, no living parents, no siblings, orphaned young, raised by an uncle who had since passed, no one waiting, no one who would write letters demanding answers. Hayashi wrote his name on the list. By the time the sun set, there were 18 names written in neat rows on the mission sheet. Akira Tanaka's name was first. The boy with 2 younger sisters was not there at all. Hayashi sat alone in his office staring at the list. He had saved one by choosing another. It was not mercy. It was arithmetic, cold and precise. He was no longer an officer carrying out orders. He was something worse. He was the man who decided which lives were worth the small risk of disobedience and which were not. The next morning, the pilots assembled in the yard. Akira Tanaka stood in the second row. His flight suit hung slightly loose on a frame that had lost weight during his recovery. The white headband was tied around his forehead, the knot tight enough to press into healing skin. His hands did not tremble now. They were perfectly still, pressed flat against his thighs. His face was empty. Hayashi watched from the edge of the runway as the planes were prepared. Engine started, fuel checked, explosive payload secured beneath each fuselage. When the photographer came, Tanaka did not smile. He did not look at the camera. He stared straight ahead, eyes focused on something far beyond the lens. The camera clicked anyway. The green flag rose. One by one, the planes began to roll. Tanaka's aircraft was third in line. It gathered speed smoothly this time. No hesitation, no wobble. The wheels lifted cleanly from the concrete. The nose tilted upward. The plane climbed into the gray morning sky without faltering. Hayashi stood at the edge of the runway and watched until all 18 shapes had disappeared into the distance. Hours later, the radio crackled to life. The voices that came through were frantic, overlapping, desperate. Contact. Heavy fire. We're breaking up. Engine hit. Can't hold altitude. I see the ship. I'm going in. Then, faintly, a voice Hayashi recognized. This is Tanaka. A long pause. The sound of labored breathing. I see it. I see the carrier. Another pause, longer this time. Then, so quietly it was almost lost in the static. I'm sorry. The transmission cut out. In the operations hut, the officer at the telephone listened, wrote notes, then hung up. 3 ships hit, he reported. 1 sunk, 2 damaged, all aircraft lost. The red stamps came out again. 18 names, 18 completed missions. Hayashi stood in his office, alone, staring at the list. Akira Tanaka had apologized. Not to his mother, not to his commanders, not to the Empire. Just sorry. As if he had failed something fundamental that no one else had the words to name. That night, Hayashi walked to the cliffs again. The wind was stronger than usual, pulling at his uniform, tugging at the papers he carried. He had brought 3 letters with him. The first was Haruto Sato's letter, the one asking him to watch over Kenji. The second was Kenji's final letter, thanking him for being a man of honor. The third was a blank sheet of paper. He stood at the edge of the cliff and stared at the blank page for a long time. Then he knelt, using a flat rock as a makeshift desk, and began to write. The letter was addressed to Haruto Sato. He wrote slowly, each character deliberate. I am the officer your son served under. You asked me to watch over him. I did not. I sent him to die. I lied to him in his final hours. He believed I was a man of honor. He was wrong. Your son thanked me in his last letter for protecting him. He died believing his death mattered. I told him it would. That was a lie. I am writing this so you will know the truth. Your son did not die because of courage or duty. He died because I wrote his name on a list. It took 3 seconds. You saved my life once. I repaid you by taking your son's. That is the kind of officer I became. He signed it. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in an envelope. He addressed it in the same neat hand. He did not seal it. Instead, he held it over the edge of the cliff, the wind pulling at the paper, threatening to tear it from his grip. For a long moment, he simply stood there, the letter suspended between his hands and the sea below. Then he pulled it back. He could not send it, not because he was afraid, but because sending it would be another kind of lie. It would pretend that confession mattered, that truth could undo what had been done, that words on paper could carry weight against the fact of a boy's body sinking into cold water, still strapped into a cockpit, eyes open and unseeing. Haruto Sato did not need Hayashi's guilt. He needed his son back, and Hayashi could not give him that. He folded the letter again, smaller this time, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. The wind howled around him. Far below, the sea continued its slow, patient work, chewing at the base of the cliffs, indifferent to the men who stood above it and the choices that broke them. Hayashi turned and walked back toward the base. Behind him, the horizon was empty. Tomorrow, there would be new orders, new names, new lists, and he would write them, one stroke at a time, because that was what he had become. Not a man of honor, not a soldier, just a hand holding a pen, deciding who would burn next and whether their deaths would mean anything at all.